Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining this webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is an introduction to dried blood spot testing, and it's specifically focused on helping athletes and talking to athletes about this. So dried blood spot testing is also called DBS, and we have three fantastic speakers with us today. We have Dr. Laura Lewis, we have Dr. Léonie Egli, and Dr. Yuhan Tan. So three incredibly smart people to talk to us about DBS and all the things that we need to know, especially from what athletes need to know about DBS. So this is one of the webinars that the WADA Athlete Committee puts on, one of a series over the last 2 years. And we are trying to organise these every second month this year. So please sign up when you see them, please join in. And if there are any topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please let us know. You also have the chance to ask questions during this webinar. So the format is that we will hear from each of the speakers and then we will go to a Q&A at the end. So please enter your questions into the side panel. And if they're good questions, we'll come to them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, and there will be a recording available on WADA's website after this. So please, if you know people that haven't been able to make the webinar, please share it with them and share it with your community, because the more people that know about dried blood spot testing and what's happening, the better. But as part of that, there is a little bit of housekeeping. So in terms of the recording and the webinar, WADA will not use your personal information for any direct marketing or unsolicited follow-up unless you have first been informed of and expressly consented to this use. And WADA will not share personal information with third parties except where required by law or legal process. Lastly, there will be a survey as well. So when you log off the webinar, a survey will pop up, and it would be really great if you could fill in those survey questions. We also have behind the scenes here, we have Salva. Salva is going to be running the technical side of things. So if you hear us talking to Salva and you can't see her on screen, she's the one behind the scenes making all of this work. So thank you, Salva, for doing that, and thank you for changing the slide over. So our outline for today's webinar, we're going to start off with Léonie, who will give us an overview of dried blood spot testing, and also, what WADA's role in this is. And then we'll go on to, and I should say that Léonie is the project manager for DBS at WADA. We'll then go on to Dr. Laura Lewis, who is the science director of science, I believe that's the correct title, at USADA, and she will give us an anti-doping organisation's perspective. And then we move to Dr. Yuhan Tan, who's a member of WADA's Athlete Committee, former badminton athlete, and just been a member of the Independent Observers Program at the Beijing Winter Olympics. And he'll talk to us about the athlete perspective. And then we'll come back and have the Q&A. But we're all going to stay on camera here, and we're going to try and make this as much of a discussion as we can. So please sit back and enjoy, and ask any questions that you have in the pop-up box to the side. And for starters, I'll hand over to Dr. Léonie Egli to start us off.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm now quite sure that many of you have heard or read about DBS testing and its introduction at the Winter Olympic Games. You may also have heard about it from your federation or NADO. So I hope that with the webinar today, we will be able to give you a good idea of what you may experience during the sample collection session, and also how your ADO might use these samples in their program. So first, when we refer to DBS samples, we are talking about small volumes of blood that are collected by the puncture of the skin to access the small capillaries. And then this blood is deposited onto an absorbent sample support, usually a cellulose card, and it's allowed to dry. So maybe to give you an idea of the volumes we are talking about, the volume collected represents only 2 to 3% of what you would usually collect or give for an athlete's biological passport sample. So it's really much smaller. And DBS testing is actually not something that is new, and it has been used in many different fields of application for decades now. And I'm sure that the majority of you has already had DBS testing in your life because it's been used in many countries for the screening of metabolic disorders in newborns since the 60s already. Also in anti-doping, there were some labs who started to do some research almost 20 years ago, and more recently some ADOs or anti-doping organizations also followed and conducted some research projects. There are actually two main categories of sample collection material that can be used. One is to be used for the collection at the fingertip, and the second category is for the collection on the upper arm. There are also some alternative sites of puncture that may be authorized for athletes with physical impairments if required. So first, with the cellulose base cards or the paper cards, they are used together with the lancet. So the lancet is used to puncture the skin of your finger. And then the drops of blood are deposited either directly onto a cellulose card or with the help of a small capillary tube. So this option is usually the cheapest one, and the cellulose cards are also what has been used for quite some time in the labs now. So this may indicate that some ADOs may want to start with this option first. But there are also some disadvantages to this option because the finger pricking may become painful when it's done repeatedly. Then for the second category of devices with integrated microneedles or microlancet, they are usually used for the collection on the upper arm. So Laura will explain you very well how that works, but the collection is almost fully automated, and it's usually the option that athletes or patients prefer. There are also some disadvantages to this option because this material is more costly, and it's also not yet available in every country. So some ADOs may actually not have the possibility of using this material now. So it's important for you to know that it will be the ADO who will decide on the equipment they want to use, which means that you may have to experience both depending who will test you. So now looking a bit closer at the sample collection process. So first you will be asked to select a sample collection and security kit, so something you're already used to do for the other types of sample. And the DCO will explain you to check all the seals of the selected equipment to make sure that they are still intact. So then once the equipment or the boxes are open, you will also have to check the code numbers to make sure that they match on all pieces of equipment. Then with your help, the DCO will assess the most suitable location for the puncture. And it should be a location that is unlikely to adversely affect you or your future sporting performance. So for example, we would usually recommend to select the non-dominant hand or non-dominant arm for the collection. When the sample is collected at the fingertip, we also recommend to use the ring finger or the middle finger because it's easier to collect blood from these fingers and it's also a bit less painful. Then in order to increase the blood flow and for a successful collection, you will be asked to warm the sample collection site. So this can be done in different ways. For example, you may wash your hands in warm water, you may shake your hand or your arm, or you may also massage the puncture site. So once this has been done, the DCO will clean your skin with disinfectant and then can collect the sample. So when collecting at the fingertip, the DCO will use the lancet to puncture your skin. Then the first drop of blood will be wiped away, and then the following drops will be deposited onto the card. For the collection on the upper arm, again, the principle is similar, but Laura will explain it better a bit later. So once the samples have been collected, they will be transferred into a security case to protect your sample, and you will be asked to seal the boxes or the kits. So on the next slide, we will show you a video representing or demonstrating the collection at the fingertip. So first, you will be asked to select the collection and security kits and to check that they are still sealed and intact. Then you will be asked also to check the code numbers. And the DCO will then help you select the site of puncture. The DCO will explain you then to warm the site of collection to increase blood flow. And once this is done, the DCO will clean and disinfect the site of puncture and puncture your finger with the lancet. So the first drop is wiped away, and then the following drops will be collected. So this is the equipment that was used during the Olympic Games in Beijing. And this equipment has actually 3 micro channels. So your blood will flow into these channels. Several drops are collected. And once this is done, the DCO will close the lid, and the blood will be transferred from the microchannels onto the cellulose card or onto the paper. Then we will just apply pressure on the site of puncture to stop bleeding, and the DCO will apply a dressing on your finger. And finally, the samples will be sealed. So the DCO will insert the cards into the security cases. Here it's 2 separate cases for the A and B samples. And finally, you will be asked to insert these cases into a plastic bag and to seal this bag. So on the next slide, I will explain you how this collection procedure differ from what you've experienced with urine and blood collection. So first, I think you've heard me repeatedly saying that it's the DCO who is actively involved in the collection of these samples. So because there is no venipuncture, no blood draw, there is no need for a blood collection officer or BCO to collect these samples. So this is true in many countries, but there may be also some different local regulations, so this may change from one country to the other. There is also no need to have a DCO of the same gender as the athletes, because the collection procedure is less intrusive than the urine collection. And unlike the blood collection procedure, you won't be required to sit for 10 minutes prior to sample collection or to wait for 2 hours after exercise. So this requirement may still need in the future, still change in the future, but that's how it is today. And now we are still in the early stages of implementation of DBS testing in anti-doping. and the equipment manufacturers are also adapting and further developing their equipment. So some kits today have already very strong tamper evident sealing systems, similar to what you had observed for the urine and blood samples. But ADOs may also use different types of tamper-proof or tamper-evident kits with plastic bags with the proper seals on the plastic bags. So please also do expect some changes and adaptation to these pieces of equipment in the future. The DBS samples are usually very stable. So it's usually more stable than a urine or a blood sample. So they don't need to be refrigerated for their transport. But having said that, there is also no harm in refrigerating these samples. So you may also observe that your sample collection authority will pack your DBS samples together with some other blood samples and will ship them together to the lab. But in general, all biological samples are quite sensitive to light exposure. So this is why the samples will be further packed, usually in aluminum foil bags or in cardboard boxes. So you may see different layers of packaging of your samples. Next slide, please. DBS testing has already started last year, but it's not mandatory for the ADOs and for the labs to do DBS testing. So that means that some athletes may be tested more frequently than others, depending on your testing authorities. Some ADOs may actually decide not to introduce DBS testing now, or even not for a long time. And the same is true for the labs. So some labs today don't accept these samples and don't analyze them, which means that, for example, your urine sample may be shipped to one lab and your DBS sample may be shipped to another one. But while DBS testing isn't mandatory for ADOs and labs, you as an athlete can't refuse to submit to DBS sample collection if it's been requested by your ADO. And if there is a positive finding, a substance that is detected in an athlete sample, this finding may be used to support a potential anti-doping rule violation, and it doesn't need to be further supported or confirmed by additional evidence from urine samples or serum samples. And finally, be ready and expect that the number of samples collected by ADOs will increase in the coming years. The current scope of DBS testing doesn't cover the full list of prohibited substances and methods, but today it's limited to the detection of exogenous substances, which means all substances that are not produced by our body. It's also restricted to the detection of prohibited substances that are prohibited at all times. So, for example, today, DBS sample can be used for the detection of substances that are prohibited in competition only, such as stimulants. And finally, DBS is only used for the reporting of substances that are reported at any level. So all threshold substances such as growth hormone can't be reported as positive finding in DBS today. But there are still some interesting applications. And for example, it can be used to complement the urine and blood samples for the detection of substances that are either not easily detected in urine or blood, or that are rapidly degraded in urine and blood. So for you, it's important to know that you may have to submit to the collection of the 3 types of sample. So an ADO may decide to collect a urine, a blood, and a DBS sample, even at the same sample collection session. DBS testing can be used also to increase the total number of tests and test in situations where urine and or blood samples couldn't be collected because of practical reasons, such as testing in remote areas. So in this case, if a DBS sample is collected alone, so without a urine or a blood sample collected during the same session, only a limited analytical menu for a smaller number of substances would be applied, instead of covering the full list of prohibited substances and methods. And finally, some ADOs may decide to use a mix of DBS and urine samples on athletes who are at lower risk of doping. So for example, collecting one day only a urine sample, and at the following collection session to collect only a DBS sample. So I think, or I hope the message is clear that DBS testing can't be used to replace completely the urine and blood samples today. So there are still some limitations, and we are actually working, I mean, all stakeholders are working hard to broaden the scope of DBS testing. But today, the number of methods available in the labs are still limited. WADA also doesn't allow to use DBS for the substances that are within the scope of the document that we call the TDS essay. So for example, we can't use DBS for reporting any growth hormone results. DBS also can't replace the blood tubes we are collecting today for the hematological passport. And of course, with time, we are hoping to extend the list of analyses available, methods available, but we should keep in mind that the volume collected is very small. So there will always be some limitations in the number of analyses that can be done on one sample. So before giving the floor to Laura, I just would like to thank all our partners in this project and on the development of DBS testing. So it wasn't really, or it wasn't at all only WADA's work. It was a real collaborative effort. So I take this opportunity to thank the steering committee organizations, all the organizations who also supported financially the development of this testing, the working groups, all advisors all along the project, and also to thank you athletes who participated in some of our research projects. So now I'm happy to give the floor to Laura, and she will present the tremendous work that USADA has done in the past years. Thank you.
Thank you, Léonie, and thank you, WADA, for giving me the opportunity to present at this webinar. So I'm the Director of Science at the US Anti-Doping Agency, and so I'm going to provide an anti-doping organization's perspective for the use of dried blood spots. As Léonie mentioned, there's different anti-doping organizations can and will have different strategies for implementing DBS, but just bear in mind that I'm going to describe the experience and the approach that we've taken at USADA. I'm also going to give you an overview of the sample collection process that we use, and then I'm going to finish with some thoughts about our hopes for the future of DBS testing. So the start of the pandemic in 2020 brought all of us many challenges, but in terms of DBS, there was actually one positive opportunity. Many of you might have heard of Project Believe, and perhaps some of you listening today were even involved in Project Believe. This was a USADA initiative that was designed to continue testing athletes during the pandemic using virtual collections. Now, DBS is the perfect candidate for a virtual collection, because the entire process could be completed via a Zoom call, much like we've all experienced over the past couple of years. USADA sent the equipment directly to the athletes that volunteered to participate in Project Believe, and then the sample was collected, as I said, during a Zoom call, and then the sample could be shipped by the athlete in the regular mail to the laboratory for analysis. Upon completion of the project, we actually asked the athletes involved how easily they found using the equipment, and they all agreed, and most strongly agreed, that once they had experience with the collection device, that using it was actually really rather easy. So Project Believe gave us the confidence at USADA that this was DBS testing was a worthwhile method that we should continue to pursue. And as such, DBS was incorporated into our testing plans for 2021 and now going forward in 2022. So some of this Léonie has already touched on, but it's important to reiterate. What makes DBS attractive to us at USADA? What are the benefits that we see, and what makes it different to venous blood? So there are many differences, not just in the type of blood that's we're collecting, but actually how the blood is collected, how it's transported, and how it's analysed. So DBS, as Léonie mentioned right at the start, uses capillary blood and not venous blood. And therefore, we don't need a venipuncture. In the US, we don't need a trained phlebotomist. And the amount of blood that we're collecting is actually much smaller. So a venous blood sample is typically 3 to 5 millilitres. We're talking with our DBS samples of 20 microlitres per spot. And we're currently collecting 4 spots. So as we've already mentioned, this is a far smaller volume that we're dealing with. The DBS samples are very easy to transport and store because they're very stable once they're dry, and they don't require specific transport conditions. But as we have also mentioned, the analytical menu is somewhat limited. And it's important to bear in mind that it takes time to develop these analytical methods. But in the future, we're hoping to add more and more as the labs continue to do their really good work in this respect. So as Léonie mentioned, DBS is currently only approved for qualitative analysis. So this means that we're basically detecting whether a substance is present or not, but we can't actually tell how much of the substance is present. So for this reason, we are a fair ways off DBS replacing venous collections across the board. But from our perspective, one of the big advantages of DBS does come down to the cost. So I've tried to represent this here with the blood tubes representing the total cost of a venous sample, and then in a very unscientific and not to scale way, I have made the Tasso collection device larger or smaller in an attempt to represent how much of the cost of a venous blood sample we're dealing with in terms of DBS. So we'll start with collection costs. The collection and equipment costs of DBS are about 50% of the venous costs. And a real big saving there comes from the fact that we don't need a trained phlebotomist or blood collection officer to collect. If we're paying for an additional staff member per collection, that obviously has a big impact on the total cost. The transport costs are a massive saving on the DBS side. So DBS transport is only 8% of the venous cost. And that's really because, as I said, the DBS can go in the regular mail versus really expensive cold chain shipping that is required for venous blood samples, and also has, you know, some tight time pressures related to those. At the moment, the analysis costs are about equal, but these may reduce in the future as more methods become available and the consumable costs associated with those methods also decrease. So overall, DBS for us is only 54% of the cost of a venous collection. So for an anti-doping organisation, this can have a really big impact as to how many athletes we can actually test and how often we can test them. So how are we currently using DBS at USADA? Well, we're using it both in and out of competition. Out of competition, athletes can expect to provide both a urine and a DBS sample, but they can also expect that at times we might ask you to provide all three, so urine, DBS and a venous blood, particularly if we're needing to collect a sample for the athlete biological passport. So remember, if it's DBS but not venous, then you're not required to sit for the 10 minutes. And you also don't have to wait 2 hours post-exercise. This is really important for our in-competition collections too. And we'll find that if we're collecting DBS in competition post an actual event, these collections can actually be completed really rather quickly, especially if we're doing DBS only. So depending on the sport that you compete in, you might find that the device fills up very quickly, particularly after competition and exercise, and that's because you're already quite warm and the blood is still pumping around your body. I've actually seen some of these samples very recently being collected in a matter of seconds because the blood is still pumping around the body. But for out of competition collections at rest, it can take a little bit longer. And so it's important to warm the upper arm area before the collection process. And this may be with a heat pack or simply, by really rubbing and massaging the shoulder. So at USADA, we use the Tasso M20 device to collect our DBS samples. So this device collects 4 20 microliter pebbles or spots, and it's collected from the upper arm. The pebbles are collected within the collection pod, and then that pod can be removed and placed into the tamper evident security kit for shipping. So in a second, we'll just show you these videos. The videos provide an overview of the sample collection process. So prior to the actual collection, the same procedures as Léonie described, the athlete, as an athlete, you will select the kit that you're going, the collection device kit that you're going to use, and also the security kit device that you're going to use. The upper arm is cleaned with the alcohol swab after it has been warmed, and the alcohol is left to dry. Okay, we can play this video. Excellent. So then the athlete themselves or the DCO can stick the device onto the upper arm, and it will stay in place for the duration of the collection. You can then press the red button, and at that point the microneedle that's inside provides a small puncture to the upper arm. It takes about 3 to 5 minutes for the pods to fill, and as we'll show in the next video, this one has already had 3 pods filled, and if you watch closely, you can just see the blood filling down and completing the final pebble. Once all 4 pods are filled, the device can easily be removed just by sort of rolling it off the arm, and then a Band-Aid can just be placed over the small insertion site. And the whole collection is virtually painless, and the insertion site does not tend to bother anyone for the remainder of the day. There was actually a recent study conducted by Anti-Doping Denmark, and they found that athletes and DCOs actually preferred collecting with a dry blood spot method as opposed to doing traditional venous draws. And even more so, the athletes and the DCOs actually preferred using the upper arm device over the finger prick collections. Next slide, please. So once the sample has been collected, it will then be placed into a security kit for transport. So first, the cartridge is removed from the collection device using the kit itself. There's a little special lip on the side, and that pops off the cartridge containing the dry blood spots. They can then be placed inside the kit, and when the lid's closed, there are 4 inserts on the lid which actually push down each of those dry blood spots right inside the security kit, and then the samples themselves are completely sealed and secure within the kit and cannot be accessed and without removing the tamper-evident foil on the back, which is the job of the lab. The kit itself contains just a small amount of desiccant, which is really important to ensure that the samples are dried properly, and then the security kit is placed inside the foil bag to protect it from any light. So these kits will actually be officially launched by Innovero in March 2022. So finally, I'll finish my part with just some thoughts about the future state and where we're trying to get to with DBS. So at USADA, we'll continue to work with WADA and our various laboratory partners to, expand and develop new analysis techniques, with the hope that in the future we will be able to add new methods for DBS testing. We also believe that there is value in continuing to explore virtual testing, even once the pandemic is over, if we ever get to that point. We'll continue to assess the feasibility of DBS in testing in remote areas, as well as to inform target testing. And we'll also look at the advantages of mass testing of whole teams, particularly when the athletes themselves can be involved in the sample collection process. By pressing the button, this really might increase the number of tests that we are able to do. So with that, I will pass over to Yuhan, who's going to give us the athlete's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. First of all, thank you all for joining. I just came back from Beijing myself, as I was part of the WADA's Independent Observers program. So it was a privilege, I can say, to witness the first DBS samples being taken at the Olympics. So I was able to witness the DBS sample collection, of course, gather a lot of feedback also with my colleagues in the Independent Observers group. And I also did a DBS test myself, just to experience, to really find out what it really was. And I can say it was actually the one I witnessed and experienced myself was very quick. I think it took approximately 5 to 10 minutes to collect the sample, and of course it's much less intrusive if you compare it with a venous blood sample. One of the key points the athletes or asked if it was actually replacing a normal blood sample, and I think that is still something we need to put a lot of emphasis in, that it's not really replacing a blood sample, but it's actually an addition to a possible urine sample or a blood sample. I think a lot of athletes, as this is something very new, still don't really know. So I think it's part of our job, or also of our WADA athletes committee, to keep informing our athletes about that. Yeah, also as mentioned before, there is a lot of different kits and being used for DBS samples. We saw 2 different kits being used here during the webinar. I was able to experience the kits which was being used, which Léonie showed. One of actually in China, there were 2 different kind of needles. I mean, in terms of diameter, and for example, the thickest needle may look a bit strange or sound a bit strange, but I think the most comfortable needle was the thickest needle, because then it's actually very easy to find the 3 blood droplets, because then the DCO didn't really have to milk the finger. We actually called it milking, because that was experienced by the athletes as being the less comfortable part of the whole process. My experience was that the thickest needle was the most comfortable, because it's actually a little bit faster, and there's not as much milking of the finger to do as when you take the thin needle. And what Léonie explained very well, and what we also saw was very important, because it was also very cold in China, is that you have to try to warm up the finger or the shoulder, whatever you're going to use. And also what we saw was useful is if the athlete could actually let the finger hang a little bit from the table, for example, to let gravity work. So it's also less important to do some milking of the finger. So it's speeding up the process and being more comfortable for the athletes. The last thing, of course, it's a new thing. So I think what is very important, and it's the same with the urine sample collection or the blood sample collection, is that if you have any concerns, you have to record it, contact your ADO, write it on the doping control form, because I think feedback is still very important at this phase. This was also addressed in Beijing, that any feedback we had was very useful to keep increasing, to keep improving the DBS experience for athletes. But in general, athletes were very positive. I can, as Laura said, the Danish study was completed to compare a blood sample collection with a DBS sample collection, and many of the athletes which had a DBS sample collection also said the same thing, that is actually much more comfortable than a normal blood sample collection. But then again, it's not. It's I think still very important to emphasize that it's not going to replace a blood sample collection. That's for me. I don't know if there are any questions.
Thanks, Yuhan. That's fantastic. That's really good, and really good to hear of the experience in Beijing when this is all quite new for everyone. So that's really valuable. Léonie and Laura, that was brilliant as well. So thank you very much. There've been quite a few questions come through, and I've got some questions. So if you're listening and you have a question, please enter the question into the side panel. and we'll try to get to it. So we'll try and do questions for 10, 15 minutes maybe, and sort of have a discussion around some of these points as well. The first question, Laura, I had, which is probably quite an easy question, was how does the shoulder device stay stuck to the shoulder?
Yeah, so there's a small sort of sticky section. You pull a tab off before you stick it on, and then it's just this slight adhesive that sticks on there, but not so much as some sports tape that you really have to like rip the device off. Once you're ready, once you've finished with the collection, it's just a matter of sort of slightly rolling it off the shoulder to get it off.
Okay. We've had quite a few questions about what dried blood spot testing can detect, but I think we've done a pretty good job of answering those questions. So it's not the full menu that you would have with a urine sample or a full blood sample. So it is still limited, but I think this is one of the areas where, and Léonie, you might be able to talk to this, where my understanding is that there's a lot of science work going on in this field, and so even though it's quite limited at the moment, more substances will be added to this in the future, or that is what the hope for dried blood spot testing is.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and I think I've given a few examples about what DBS can't be used for, and I mentioned, for example, growth hormone or stimulants, but actually these are substances or markers that can be detected today in DBS, but WADA hasn't had put a frame for that. So for example, for growth hormone, there are some thresholds established in serum samples, and if we were to use DBS for detecting the administration of growth hormone in DBS, we would need to redefine this threshold. So that's not impossible. We have seen some very good work done by the labs, but it will still take time before we have enough information and enough data to establish these new reference levels.
Yeah, thank you. What's another question in here? Oh, one of the questions was around the puncture sites. Are there alternative puncture sites to the fingers and the shoulders that athletes could be asked for? Or is it just limited to fingers and shoulder?
So it's limited to finger and shoulder now, but for athletes with physical impairments, if it's required, alternative site can be used. So we know that the collection at the earlobe works well. So with the Lancet, that's totally possible. And maybe Laura, you can comment on that. But I think for TASO, there have been some tests also to use it on the abdomen. So there are definitely some alternative if the fingertip or the upper arm isn't accessible.
Yeah, that's 100% correct, Léonie. The abdomen is an alternative to the upper arm. So, but as Léonie said, the fingers and the upper arm would be used if possible to start with.
Thanks. Another question that came up, and I think this was more in relation to the finger prick Lancet method. Does the blood need to dry at all? Because I noticed, Laura, that you spoke about the blood drying in the package with the TASO, but is that the same for the fingerprint?
Yes, it's the same. So that's a requirement we have established in our technical document. So the document that WADA and the working group developed, we didn't want the athletes to have to wait for 30 minutes or 1 hour and staying with the sample open in the station. So we want or we require the testing authority to use material that allow the sample to dry when it's already packed. So Laura mentioned that in the tasso there is some desiccant, and that's also true for the other types of equipment.
Yeah, that's from an athlete point of view, that's really good, because the quicker and easier we can make this, and if it's already built in that it dries, that's brilliant. Because I think looking at this from an athlete point of view, one of the big benefits of this is that it is potentially a lot quicker and easier and less intrusive, especially than giving a full blood sample. Let's see what else, what other questions in here. There's a question around whose choice will it be, whether it's a finger collection or arm collection. I think that's going to be based just off which device the sample collection agency is using. So they will probably have a preference, and they will ask you to follow through on that. Is the hope that DBS will eventually completely replace the standard blood sample collection system? Maybe Léonie or Laura, you can answer this. I guess my perspective would be that maybe one day, but it's probably a long way off.
Yeah, if we had a crystal ball, that would be really, really great to look through to the future. I mean, we're going to continue to work with the labs and conduct the research to move in that direction, but it's really hard to put a time limit on if and when that might be fully possible.
Yes, that's true, and we know that there are some hopes about that. There are actually some interesting work that has been done by some labs, so some results seem to be promising. But for a method such as the blood passport, everything needs to be very well standardized so that your sample can be analyzed in Brazil or in China, and they will have identical results. So that's also something we need to work on for DBS, because today the result the lab will give is just presence of absence. So they won't be given an exact concentration. So we need to work on a better harmonization of the lab analysis. And that's something that is obviously very important for the blood passport. So as Laura said, still probably a long way to go.
Thanks. And we had a few questions about B samples, and with both the techniques, I guess. And so the main question is, like, if we're collecting those 4 little dots, where in that is the B sample? Or how does the B sample come out of that?
Yeah, so I'll start with the tasso. I probably should have explained this a little bit better in my presentation, but the security kit itself is separated into the A and the B. So the A contains 3 of the spots, and the B contains 1, and each one can be accessed individually without having to open the whole thing up. So that's where if the A returns a positive, then we do have the B here for the B analysis.
And maybe if I can explain also for the equipment that's been used in Beijing during the games. So I'm not sure you can see it well, but these are basically what was shown on the video. So there are 2 different parts. This would be the A sample with 2 different spots. And this would be the B sample with only 1 spot. And then each of them will be stored separately, independently in the security cases. So there is a minimum to have at least 2 A spots, or a minimum of the equivalent of 40 microliters of blood for the A sample, and of course a minimum of 1 spot for the B sample, or the equivalent of 20 microliters.
Thanks. There's also been a couple of questions, one around what happens if an athlete has a needle phobia, another one around what happens if the athlete has some sort of allergy to the adhesive for the shoulder. Does anyone have any solutions or answers to those sorts of questions?
So the lancets that you use, either the ones contained in the tasso for the upper arm, or the lancets that are used for the finger pricks, the microneedle is contained within the whole device, so you never actually see the needle. So that, you know, can actually help with that, because someone's not coming at you with this needle. And so at the push of a button, the microneedle inserts and then retracts and is completely contained within the device. So it often, you know, the first time athletes may, you know, be slightly apprehensive, but I think if once they experience for the first time, and you know, they'll realize that, you know, there's not too much to be concerned about, and many athletes, particularly with the finger pricks, they will often have experienced lactate testing in their sport, and it's the same type of needle as that. In terms of the reaction to the adhesive, we have not experienced anything in that regard, but you know, it would certainly be dealt with, you know, we taken seriously on a case-by-case basis. But the device is not stuck onto the arm for very long, you know, a maximum of 5 minutes, and so it would be very rare for a reaction to take place. But just as if, you know, you have a reaction to, you know, a latex allergy for gloves, or a known reaction to Band-Aids, it's really important to inform the DCO at the time.
I was also, if I can just add, I was also a little bit surprised when I saw the device being used in Beijing, because I had the DBS, but I didn't see the needle. And I was looking for the needle, but it was very much hidden in the device. So yeah, I think the people who made it, the device, they thought it through very well, and it was, of course, you feel when they take when they put the needle, but it only took, let's say, 1 hour or something before I almost didn't feel anything, any discomfort anymore in the finger. So I think this is also something which is important for athletes, because athletes, of course, might be worried about their performance when they had a puncture in the finger, but I think it won't be affecting the performance that much, if not at all.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good points. One question we had was about the tasso devices. Is the entire device just used once and then thrown away? Or, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the needle retracts inside, so you know, there's not a sharp's concern with a, you know, an exposed needle. It's a one-time use only device.
And maybe the last question for this is, and maybe to all of you, and what do you think the next steps with DBS will be? Like, we've got to this stage where we're launching it. You know, where do you think we go from here? Léonie, I'll start with you.
Should I start? Yes. So I'm a scientist, so I'll talk mainly about the scientific development. So I think there is a real value, or there will be a real value when using DBS for in-competition testing and looking specifically at the concentration of some substances during the in-competition period. So that's the next development we want to bring, and I think that will bring a great advantage and great benefit to anti-doping programs.
Thanks. Over to you, Laura.
Yeah, I guess from USADA's side at this point, it's all about, you know, maximizing testing distribution plan, getting testing, you know, the right athletes at the right time with the right test, and, you know, expanding who we can test and how frequently.
Thanks. And Yuhan, from what you've seen and experienced?
I think from an athlete's perspective, it's of course, I hope that more and more substances can be detected through this way, given the advantages it has. So I'm aware that it's still a long way to go, but I hope that eventually we'll reach a point where a lot of substances can be detected through DBS.
Thank you to the three of you, and I think that we'll wrap up here. So from me, a huge thanks to Léonie, Laura, and Yuhan for all your work on this webinar and for presenting today and answering all the questions. It's incredibly valuable, and I think there are some really key takeaways for athletes and for everyone else that's listening today, and some really good points in there. So thank you so much, and thank you for your continuing work in this space. DBS is really exciting, and really looking forward to where this takes us, because from an athlete point of view, we do want testing to be as easy and quick and seamless as possible, and this is a really big step forward. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize is there's an enormous amount of work that goes on to make all of this happen. So any sort of development within anti-doping, there's obviously all the science, there's all the legal frameworks, and so thank you to Léonie and Laura and Yuhan and your teams and everyone who's got it this far, and we really look forward to what happens in the future and being able to add more substances and expand this even further. So thank you very much. Also thank you to Salva from behind the scenes for making this all work today. Like I said at the beginning, there is a recording of this webinar, and that'll be available on WADA's website shortly. So if you want to share it with your friends or colleagues, please do. And there's also a short survey that will come up once you log out. So please fill that in, and if you have any questions, you can add questions in there, and anything you want to tell us about, please do so there. But on behalf of the WADA Athlete Committee, thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope this has been informative. And there will be another webinar that we'll put on probably in a couple of months, topic yet to be decided, so please stay tuned, because we'll try and make that one a good one as well. So thank you very much for signing in, and thank you so much to our presenters today.
Thank you very much.